All right, guys, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be talking about America entering World War II. So to get us started, just to kind of cover our, go over what to expect within this video, we're going to be talking about how America plans and prepares for war, talking about Pearl Harbor, Japanese internment, America specifically during wartime, the end of the war in Europe, and then the atomic bomb and the end of the war in the Pacific. So the vocabulary that we're covering is going to be the Lend-Lease Act, Atlantic Charter, Japanese internment, Manhattan Project, rationing, D-Day, and VE Day. So let's go ahead and let's get this started. So to kick this off, President FDR in World War II. Now, FDR is a really unique president in that he was not only reelected for a third term before World War before World War II had started for the United States, but he'd also been elected for a fourth term following this. So as noted in a previous video, he used to host these fireside radio chats so that he could be kind of better understood by the American people. And it was through this avenue that he took advantage of really trying to spread the word that America needed to enter World War II. He quotes, "No man can tame a tiger into a kitten by stroking it," referring to Hitler and the fact that he truly did not believe that peace could be negotiated with Hitler, and that he believed if Britain fell to the Axis powers, that ultimately the Axis powers would win. And then America would, of course, be vulnerable at that point in time. So he really urges America to see why the United States should enter the war, not just because it was raging on in Europe, but because he truly felt that at some point in time it was going to affect the United States, and best to come out prepared than to be hit unexpected. Now, kind of along these lines with wanting to support the Allies, in 1940, Britain was really running out of money to fight. France had already fallen to German occupation, and FDR again felt strongly about stepping in and helping the Allies. And so he suggests something called the Lend-Lease Act in order to help. Now, this is one of our vocabulary words. The Lend-Lease Act, it was a law passed in 1941, and it allowed the United States to ship arms and other supplies without immediate payments to nations who are fighting the Axis powers. So not specifically Britain, but really any allied country that was up against the fight towards Hitler, Nazi Germany, and the Axis powers. An easy way to think about how the Lend-Lease Act worked, at least the way that FDR really sold it to Congress, was if you take a look at this picture below. So we're going to pretend that this right here, this is Great Britain. Great Britain's on fire, right? They're being attacked by Nazi Germany. They're dealing with many air raids, and they're essentially a house on fire, right? They are suffering. They've run out of money. And so FDR suggests if we are neighbors with somebody and we notice that their house is on fire, is it not in our good nature to not only lend them our garden hose, right, so that we can douse the fire, but to also prevent that fire from spreading to our home? And so with this point of view, he really saw the Lend-Lease Act as not just helping Great Britain against Nazi Germany and specifically the Axis powers, but he really saw this as an avenue to prevent war coming to the United States. Now, despite the fact that there are many isolationists that are against this, for the most part, people are really supportive of the Lend-Lease Act, and it is approved by Congress. All right, so World War II. The United States still is not involved heavily in World War II. We have not officially declared war on any particular group. But I want to go over these three guys in this picture. So if you remember, we've got Joseph Stalin. He was this totalitarian communist dictator that we discussed last week. And remember, he had that really shocking pact that he made with Hitler, essentially not to fight. Well, it really shouldn't come as a shock to you, but Hitler did did not honor that agreement. And Hitler does end up invading the Soviet Union. And so Joseph Stalin is soon at a point where he needs Allied help in now fighting Nazi Germany. And so we have President FDR, who is very involved with World War II, even though the United States has not specifically declared war. And then we have Winston Churchill, who is going to be our representative for Great Britain. And President FDR's perspective on Joseph Stalin needing assistance was basically the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So they saw it as more or less that they are fighting a mutual enemy here. And Winston Churchill responds, if Hitler invaded hell, the British would be prepared to work with the devil himself. So again, both of these two allied powers recognizing that Joseph Stalin is a very unlikely ally, but that because he is also fighting against Nazi Germany, he is not specifically a bad ally to go into business with at this point in time. And so ultimately, the Soviet Union ends up joining Allied forces, and all three countries will be fighting Nazi Germany. So, with this Lend-Lease Act, now America is not only helping Great Britain, but we are also helping the Soviet Union. And Germany specifically starts to target these supply lines because that's what the Lend-Lease Act was. It was an effort to try and ship arms, weapons, and supplies to the Allied forces so that America could better help them fight in the war. And so all shipments to Britain and the Soviet Union, they were taking place over the Atlantic Ocean. Now, obviously, this is a very wide space in which lots of damage can be done. We remember back from World War I that Germany had really mastered the art of submarine warfare, and this was a massive, massive defensive strategy for them. And so in the same way that in World War I, Germany uses their submarine warfare, Hitler brings this back. Hitler deploys German U-boats, submarines, to attack these supply convoys. They used to use this tactic called wolf pack attacks. And so ultimately, there would be a series of submarines that would go out at night, essentially looking for supply lines. And so these wolf pack attacks actually sunk 350,000 tons worth of shipments in just 1 month. And so they're very, very effective and very damaging to the Allied forces. And so then what we start to move into is the Atlantic Charter. So this is again a vocabulary word. And so we have Roosevelt and Churchill secretly meet aboard the USS Augusta. Again, the United States is not yet at war. We have not declared war, and we have not been approved by Congress to be specifically fighting in the war. There are still many people who are isolationists, who are very, very much against the United States entering World War II, essentially getting involved in European affairs. And so that's why we have these two focal leaders meeting in secret, okay? And so in this meeting, they create a joint declaration of aims, and they call it the Atlantic Charter. Ultimately, what both countries plan to do is they pledge collective security, disarmament, self-determination, economic cooperation, and a freedom of the seas. The Atlantic Charter becomes the basis for this new idea of something called the United Nations. And if this sounds familiar because you've heard of the United Nations before, you are thinking of the same thing, okay? And so it evolves into a group of 26 or more countries who are basically allied powers who are willing to fight for the above listed items, and they're willing to work together in order to achieve these means. Now, Congress would not approve a declaration of war on Germany, not specifically at this time at least, because America had not specifically been attacked. Roosevelt, in this situation, promises to Winston Churchill to do everything he possibly can to wage war and force an incident. And so a lot of this comes from the Lend-Lease Act, with America shipping supplies to Allied powers. more or less trying to provoke Germany. But so far, nothing has specifically happened. All right. In comes the Pacific Theater. And so not only do we have a world war really playing out in Europe, but at this point in time, we also have another empire that is seizing every opportunity it can to expand its powers and really take advantage of the distractions that are happening in Europe. And so we have specifically Japan, who is seizing this opportunity in the Pacific to expand their empire. So, first, what we have is back in 1931, they had already taken control of Manchuria. So, I've got a nice map over here. So, we have Manchuria over here just to kind of give us some location points. We have Japan, which is an entire island. So, we have that they took Manchuria, part of China, in 1931. Now, in 1937, they begin invading China and they start taking on more locations within China. Now, with Europe preoccupied and with Europe owning many colonies within Southeast Asia, more or less they're unprotected, right? They're trying to send all of their weapons, all of their manpower to fighting the war in Europe. And Japan recognizes this. They recognize that there are many islands and many colonies in which European countries have left virtually unprotected. And so in 1941, Japan begins to take control of Indochina. This is going to include Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, not to mention many other smaller islands within this southeast region. Now, America protests this aggressive land taking or island hopping, however you want to call it, and to show Japan that they really disagree with the tactics they are using, with what it is that they are trying to do. America actually cuts off trade with Japan to try and put some pressure on their country. And so we can see here, if we're taking a look at the map, the yellow is going to represent the Japanese Empire, right, which I pointed out before. But then we have the yellow and green stripes, which is going to signify Japanese gains by 1942. And so by 1942, we can see that Japan had expanded not only to Manchuria, they had taken the city of Beijing. We see that if we keep moving down, they had taken Burma, Thailand, Indochina, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, parts of New Guinea. And it's only from here that they're going to begin island hopping to try and put more of a threat towards America. Now, there are some peace talks. However, there are really rising tensions within the Pacific. So, by cutting off trade, the United States cut off Japan's oil supplies. And it was recognized very early on that without oil, Japanese military had little options to fuel their expansion, literally. And so the Japanese military leaders, they feared that without oil to power their boats, their planes, their vehicles, that they would ultimately lose their war or their expansion without really even fighting the enemy. And so at this point in time, they saw two options. Okay. Option one was that they would negotiate with the United States to try and reopen trade. And then option two is going to be to seize the oil fields within the Dutch East Indies. And so if we go back a slide, the Dutch East Indies are going to be located right down here. And so they have these two options. They're trying to figure out what is necessarily best for their country. It doesn't seem like at this point in time that they're too concerned about a war. And in fact, they almost anticipate a war to be coming. And by 1941, the United States had broken Japanese communication, different codes that the Japanese were using to relay important messages about what their plans held, whether it be regarding these two options or their further expansion. And within this code breaking, the United States realizes by deciphering the messages that are going past that Japan has the intention of striking America one way or another. And so President FDR, he's very clear about the fact that Japan had to make the first attack. He was not going to declare war. In fact, he probably wouldn't have been approved if he declared war. Congress likely would not have allowed that to pass. And so what he ends up doing instead is he sends a warning out to American bases in the Philippines, Guam, and Hawaii. And ultimately, they just sat there and waited, knowing that at some point in time, the Japanese military had a strike in mind, but not necessarily knowing where or when, only that it had to be Japan first for America to actually be able to enter the war. And so it happens on December 7th that Pearl Harbor is bombed. On this morning, early morning, Japanese dive bombers swarmed Pearl Harbor. More than 180 Japanese warplanes flew into Hawaii. Radio operators on the Pearl Harbor Naval Base sent out the message, air raid on Pearl Harbor. This is not a drill. And so, more than 1.5 hours, the Japanese attacked really without little to no disturbance because it was such a surprise. It took a great deal of effort for American troops to simply prepare a defensive move. And so by the time the last plane soared by at 9:30 a.m., the damage was extremely severe. In less than 2 hours, over 2,400 Americans had been killed, and war was declared by the United States the next day on Japan. 2 days following America's declaration of war against Japan, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. So now we have to switch gears just a little bit before we have America really as an outside factor helping the Allies. But now we have America specifically mobilizing and preparing for war. So, to get us started, we have selective service and the GI. And yes, that is a gif of Captain America, my favorite superhero. So, after Pearl Harbor, eager young Americans signed up to fight. I have a quote below. It says, I wanted to be a hero. Let's face it, I was having trouble in school. The war had been going on for 2 years. I didn't want to miss it. I was an American. I was 17. And so 5 million volunteered for service. It actually wasn't enough. Selective service actually ended up having to expand the draft, which did help recruit another 10 million soldiers. Now, new recruits and draftees were sent to basic training at a variety of camps within the United States, but this only lasted 8 weeks before they were expected to be soldiers ready for war. And so I have another quote below. It says, the civilian went before army doctors, took off his clothes, feeling silly, jigged, stooped, squatted, and became a soldier. He learned how to sleep in the mud, tie a knot, kill a man. He learned the ache of loneliness, the ache of exhaustion, the kinship of misery. He learned that men make the same queasy noises in the morning, feel the same longings at night, and that every man is alike and that each man is different. So, despite having many willing citizens within the United States wanting to enlist, many Americans face discrimination within the recruitment process. For many minority groups, such as African Americans, Native Americans, Mexican Americans, and Asian Americans, they truly struggled to be not only accepted within recruiting offices, but actually make it into a fighting role within World War II. In America, they were restricted and segregated within their neighborhoods, and many questioned, was it really worth fighting? I have two quotes below. The first one says, "Why die for democracy for some foreign country when we don't even have it here?" And then the second one says, "Just carve on my tombstone, here lies a black man, killed fighting a yellow man for the protection of a white man." Now, despite difficulties in attempting to being recruited or attempting to join Army or the Navy or any other sectors within the American military, over 300,000 Mexican Americans joined. About 1 million African Americans served in the military, more than 13,000 Chinese Americans served, 33,000 Japanese Americans joined the war, and some 25,000 Native Americans enlist, including 800 women. And we're going to look specifically at some really remarkable groups within these minorities that stand out in hindsight, and that were perhaps looked over at that point in time, but that are true heroes later this week. All right. Now, in addition to minorities facing discrimination when trying to be recruited, we also have the situation of Japanese Americans facing severe discrimination within the United States. And so the unexpected bombing of Pearl Harbor developed strong racial fears throughout the United States. Soon, Japanese Americans were suspected of a number of things, from sabotaging mining on the East Coast to poisoning vegetables they were growing and selling. In 1942, the War Department called for mass evacuations of the Japanese Americans within Hawaii. Now, ultimately, the governor of Hawaii really fought back against this, understanding that Japanese Americans made up over 30% of Hawaii's population. But ultimately, that population was moved to internment camps rather than being kicked out of Hawaii entirely. And we see internment camps actually spreading throughout the United States in general. And so anti-Japanese sentiment, it really sweeps through the states, not just Hawaii, but through the states. Over 1,400 Japanese Americans are sent to internment camps, specifically in Hawaii. On the mainland or on our continent, we have 110,000 Japanese Americans who are sent to a variety of camps throughout the West. And this order was signed by President FDR. This was approved through the War Department. Now, later in history, many Japanese Americans fight for justice and win regarding the hasty and unjust manner in which they were treated. And again, this is going to be a topic that we look further into this week. So, aside from racial discrimination and the segregated practices that were taking place, America is also preparing for war in a different manner. Industries had to adjust to the development of warfare really taking over the United States. So we have car manufacturing stops completely. Automobile plants begin producing tanks, planes, boats, and command cars. And even something as odd as mechanical pencil factories begin creating bomb parts. Yes, that is another gif from my favorite movie, Captain America. So, in addition to industries adjusting, we also have women taking on many new jobs that they hadn't previously been offered. Over 6 million new workers were women at this point in time, and they start taking on roles such as welding, riveting guns, and at this point in time, their stamina was questioned. But once they have shown or proved that they can do the job, many factories and many employers were beyond excited to have such a massive and strong workforce helping America fight in World War II. In addition to this, we have rationing that begins at home. And so rationing was meant for goods deemed essential to the military. These were things like meat, shoes, sugar, coffee, and gas. So you might have heard the things like Meatless Monday or Victory Gardens, okay? And in order to get the food that you did need, coupon books were used to buy these specific products so that you were limited in what you could buy, but you also still have the ability to do so. In addition to that, people were encouraged to save gas, and so they started carpooling, and Americans tried to live more scarcely in order to help the war effort. As America really gets fully into World War II, we have stronger developments in science and technology. So, President FDR creates the Office of Scientific Research in 1941, and this helps develop improvements in sonar and radar, pesticides like DDT in order to avoid lice, and then also miracle drugs such as penicillin help to save lives. Now, aside from all these things, which are both good and maybe DDT is a little sketchy, but good at the time, the most impressive accomplishment is by the Office of Scientific Research, or the OSRD, is the development of the atomic bomb. And so it became intelligence that Germany had started developing this type of weapon within 1939, or at least they were trying to develop this type of weapon. Now, this information actually came from a refugee. You might have heard of him, Albert Einstein. And he wrote to President FDR specifically warning him about Germany's intended developments and what they had hoped to do by creating an atomic bomb. Now, to create an atomic bomb, many experts quoted that it would take about 3 to 5 years, not only to catch up to the research that Germany had conducted, but also to manufacture and create it themselves. So, what FDR decides to do is develop something called the Manhattan Project, which was a very specific research, top secret research done to specifically set up the atomic bomb in a quicker speed. So, we're going to start looking at World War II coming to an end, particularly in Europe. So, it comes to an end in Europe with the attack of D Day. Now, under the command of Army Chief of Staff General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who will later become a president of the United States, he develops a plan that they are going to attack France. They're going to try and free the western half of Europe. Now, over 3 million British, American, and Canadian soldiers were rounded up. A phantom army was actually created to try and distract and mislead the Germans. The Allies had intelligence that Germany had cracked their codes, that Germany was listening in on specific intel that they were communicating. And so they actually make up all of this fake communication, and they even plant a fake army to try and distract the Germans, to try and make them think that there was some type of attack being planned for another location. Now, this operation was called Operation Overlord, took place on June 6th, and the fighting was brutal despite the surprise attack on France, which was occupied by Germany. But at last, by September, the Allies had freed France. Now, the final push is going to take place a little later on in October of 1944, where Americans actually capture their first German town, and Hitler embarks on his last chance offensive. So, this is the Battle of the Bulge. And ultimately, this battle takes a couple of months. And by the end of it, what ends up happening when the fog clears is that Nazi Germany has simply lost too many resources and too many men in order to continue fighting on. Their only choice is to retreat. And so Allied troops began liberating death camps at this point in time. We really see Nazi Germany beginning to crumble. Hitler ends up marrying his longtime companion, and he writes a final address to the German people, kind of his last word as their quote unquote leader or dictator. And within this last bit, he again blames the Jews for not only starting the war, but really being at fault for everything that had taken place following World War I. Now, Hitler and his new wife, towards the end of the war, commit suicide. And within a week, Eisenhower had accepted unconditional surrender. And so following this, we have VE Day, Victory in Europe, which takes place in May 1945. And it's with this that the war finally comes to an end in Europe. So, to finish off the war for America, We're going to be talking about the atomic bomb, and I'm not going to go into too much detail within this video simply because we have an entire day carved out for really studying this in a lot closer measure later this week. But many Americans were conflicted about how to manage the war in the Pacific. And so I have two perspectives on the screen for us to take a look at. The first perspective was that the only way to end the war against Japan was to bomb Japan. Okay. And so the arguments here was that the bomb could end the war, it could save American lives because we would be shipping less men overseas. We would have less men going to war, and ultimately it would only cost us one bomb to do so. In addition to that, if the bomb were not dropped, many argued, kind of in hindsight, but also those who had been privy to the information of the Manhattan Project, they argued that if we were not going to drop this bomb, what was the point of the development and the research? And many concluded that would be a huge waste of money if we did not use what we had been trying to develop over all these years. And then finally, the last argument within this train of thought was that Soviet tension was on the rise despite being allied with Joseph Stalin. I think many leaders within Allied forces recognized that this was a temporary measure. And so, with Soviet tension rising, many believe that if America could show their strength now, it could mean avoiding further war in the future. It would really show their strength. It would really show what America was capable of and perhaps deter other world powers from bothering us in the future. All right. So, perspective two. I have a quote that says, Japan's staggering losses were enough to force Japan to surrender. So the idea was that we did not have to drop the bomb, that we should have continued fighting and continued to send our troops and men over to the Japanese mainland. Many scientists actually favored this opinion. They doubted the necessity for such a weapon as the atomic bomb within the world, despite many of them having helped create the atomic bomb. Many believed it was immoral to drop the bomb, and they thought, well, why don't we just drop it somewhere for the Japanese to see? And that way the Japanese would know that we had that type of power, but we weren't going to necessarily demolish their cities itself. They wanted to put some type of display on to scare the Japanese into surrendering. They also believed that Japan was ultimately close to surrendering. They thought that America was winning the war and quite successfully doing so, and they didn't feel it was necessary to drop the atomic bomb in order to continue winning the war. And then finally, some simply hated the fact that we were going to be the first to use this level of weaponry. Now, ultimately, I think many of us know that the choice was to drop the atomic bomb, and we ended up dropping two bombs. And so the first one that we dropped was on Hiroshima, and the second one that we dropped was on Nagasaki. And horrified with the destruction of both of these two cities, Japan's emperor called for an immediate surrender. Again, I'm not trying to cut this subject off short, but we will be spending an entire day kind of delving deeper into both of these perspectives, as well as all of the issues that went into creating the atomic bomb itself and the aftermath. So, just to recap, we covered in this today Americans' plans and preparation for war, Pearl Harbor and Japanese internment, America specifically during wartime, the end of the war in Europe, and then finally atomic bomb and the end of the war in the Pacific. I have a vocabulary up in the corner, and I just want to give you guys a reminder that our vocabulary tests, including not only this vocabulary, but also our previously covered vocabulary from last week, will be tested this Friday, May 1st. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you took some fantastic notes. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. Other than that, you guys are going to do great on this test. I know it.